A billionaire CEO is stopped by a little boy. "Hey sir, I saw your picture under my mum's pillow." The December wind howled through the crack in the apartment window as 7-year-old Oliver clutched his teddy bear, watching his mother from the darkened hallway. Grace sat at their small kitchen table, illuminated only by the dim light above the stove, tears streaming down her face as she held a worn photograph. The Christmas tree lights blinked silently in the corner, casting intermittent shadows across the room. A sudden crash shattered the quiet moment. The front door splintered open, revealing a towering figure silhouetted against the hallway lights. Grace leapt to her feet, instinctively positioning herself between the intruder and where Oliver stood frozen in fear. "Where is it?" Grace, the man's voice was rough, familiar. "I know you still have the evidence." "Thomas, please." Grace's voice trembled but held firm. "It's Christmas Eve. Oliver is here." The mention of his name made Oliver step forward, but Grace motioned for him to stay back. The intruder, his father, moved closer, his expensive coat dusted with snow, his eyes wild with desperation. "The documents, Grace. Now, or everything you've built here." He gestured menacingly around their modest apartment. Before Grace could respond, heavy footsteps thundered up the external stairs. Thomas spun around, startled by the approach. In that moment, Grace grabbed Oliver and pushed him toward the fire escape window. "Run to Mrs. Callahan's, baby. Now." But Oliver stood his ground, something his mother had taught him breaking through his fear. "No, I won't leave you alone." The apartment door burst open again. This time, a different figure appeared, tall, commanding, but somehow familiar to Oliver. The boy's eyes widened in recognition, the man from his mother's photograph. "Step away from them," the newcomer's voice cut through the tension like steel. "The police are already on their way, Thomas." Thomas lunged forward, but the stranger moved with surprising speed, intercepting him. In the struggle that followed, Oliver watched in awe as this mysterious man, whose picture his mother kept under her pillow, protected them without hesitation. As sirens wailed in the distance, Oliver hugged his mother tightly, feeling her racing heart slow to match his. The stranger stood guard by the broken door, his expression softening as he looked at them. None of them knew it yet, but this Christmas Eve would mark the beginning of a story that would change all their lives forever. Grace Whitman had once been the pride of Riverside High School, her name consistently topping the honor roll board that hung in the main hallway. With a perfect 4.0 GPA and leadership roles in various academic clubs, she seemed destined for an Ivy League future. Her acceptance letter to Yale, complete with a full scholarship, had been her ticket out of the small town where she'd grown up. The letter remained unopened in her bedside drawer, a painful reminder of dreams deferred. Her life changed dramatically during senior year when she met Thomas Crawford, the charming son of one of the city's most prominent families. Their whirlwind romance had seemed like a fairy tale at first, the brilliant girl from the wrong side of the tracks, catching the eye of the wealthy heir. What Grace didn't realize was that she was being carefully maneuvered into a trap. The Crawfords had built their fortune on old money and carefully cultivated appearances. When Thomas got Grace pregnant just before graduation, his family saw it as an opportunity rather than a scandal. They orchestrated a hasty marriage, presenting it to the community as a romantic young love story. But behind closed doors, the reality was far darker. "You'll decline the Yale scholarship," of course, Mrs. Crawford had said during a tense family dinner, her voice leaving no room for discussion. "Family comes first, and the Crawford heir needs a proper home." Grace remembered how her hands had trembled beneath the expensive tablecloth, her dreams crumbling like the untouched bread on her plate. The first few years of marriage were a slow descent into isolation. Thomas's family systematically cut Grace off from her friends and remaining family, citing their unsuitable influence on a Crawford wife. They controlled every aspect of her life, from her wardrobe to her daily schedule. molding her into their idea of proper society wife. When Oliver was born, Grace thought things would improve. Instead, Thomas became increasingly distant, disappearing for days at a time on business trips that left him smelling of expensive perfume. His family's emotional abuse intensified, constantly criticizing her parenting and background. The final blow came when Grace discovered the truth about the Crawford family's business dealings, a web of fraud and corruption that had ruined countless lives. The night she confronted Thomas with evidence of his family's crimes, he showed his true colors. No one will believe a gold digger from the wrong side of town, he'd sneered, before emptying their joint accounts and filing for divorce. The Crawfords' high-priced lawyers painted Grace as an unstable mother, while their private investigators harassed her supporters into silence. Grace fled with 3-year-old Oliver in the middle of the night, carrying only a small bag of clothes and the damning documents she'd discovered. They spent their first month moving between cheap motels, Grace working multiple jobs while looking over her shoulder. The only person who stood by them was Mrs. Callahan, their elderly neighbor who remembered Grace from her high school days and offered them a small apartment in her building. Starting over was harder than Grace had imagined. Her prestigious academic record meant nothing without a college degree, and Thomas's family had blacklisted her from many local businesses. She took whatever work she could find, waiting tables, cleaning offices after hours, helping Mrs. Callahan with her bookkeeping. Every dollar went to building a stable life for Oliver. Through it all, Grace kept one secret close to her heart, a worn photograph from their high school yearbook. It showed Ethan Caldwell, the quiet, brilliant boy who had been different from the others. While Thomas and his friends had flaunted their wealth, Ethan had earned everything through hard work. He'd been kind to Grace in small ways. She never forgot sharing notes when she missed class for work, defending her ideas in debate club. The photo reminded her of a time when she believed in herself before the Crawfords stripped away her confidence. Now, 7 years later, Grace had rebuilt a modest but honest life for herself and Oliver. The Yale acceptance letter remained unopened, but she'd begun taking online classes during her rare free hours, determined to finish her education one small step at a time. The Crawford family's threats still loomed in the background, but Grace had learned to be stronger than her fears. Ethan Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the snow fall over the city he now partially owned. At 32, he had achieved what most would consider the American dream: CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, featured in Forbes 30 Under 30, and a net worth that placed him firmly among the country's elite. Yet as he stood there, holding a glass of expensive scotch he couldn't taste, the emptiness inside him felt more profound than ever. His rise to success had been meteoric but lonely. After losing his parents in a car accident during his sophomore year at Harvard, Ethan had thrown himself into his studies with a single-minded focus that bordered on obsession. Grief and determination fueled 18-hour workdays, and by 25 he had transformed his father's struggling manufacturing company into a technology and investment powerhouse. The newspapers loved to tell his story, the brilliant young man who built an empire from tragedy. What they didn't report were the nights he spent alone in his office, staring at old family photos, or the way his hands sometimes shook when he visited his parents' grave. Success had come at the cost of genuine connections. His last relationship had ended 2 years ago when his girlfriend told him she felt like she was dating a ghost. Every morning, Ethan's assistant Margaret would hand him a perfectly crafted schedule: board meetings, investor calls, charity galas. He moved through them like a well-programmed machine, saying the right things, making the right decisions, but feeling increasingly disconnected from the person he used to be. The passion that once drove his innovations had been replaced by a relentless pursuit of the next acquisition, the next milestone. His high school yearbook sat in his desk drawer, a reminder of simpler times. He occasionally found himself flipping through it during late nights at the office, lingering on faces he once knew. He remembered being different, then quietly ambitious but also kind, the type of person who would help struggling classmates with calculus or defend younger students from bullies. There had been a girl, too, though he rarely let himself think about her. Grace Whitman, with her brilliant mind and gentle smile, who disappeared after marrying into the Crawford family. The only real warmth in Ethan's life came from his charitable foundation, which provided scholarships to underprivileged students. He had started it in memory of his parents, who had both been teachers before his father inherited and revitalized the family business. Sometimes, reading the scholarship applications reminded him of his own past, of the person he had wanted to become before grief and ambition reshaped his world. His board of directors praised his leadership while quietly wondering about his solitary lifestyle. Rumors circulated about his reclusiveness, his inability to maintain relationships. The business papers speculated about potential mergers and acquisitions, but none of their theories captured the truth that Ethan Caldwell, for all his success, felt like he was living someone else's life. The annual Christmas Gala was approaching, another perfectly orchestrated event where he would play his role as the philanthropic CEO. Margaret had already prepared his speech, filled with appropriately inspiring messages about giving back and community spirit. But this year felt different. Something about the approaching holiday season made the emptiness of his life feel more acute, the distance between who he was and who he'd meant to be more apparent than ever. What Ethan didn't know was that fate was about to intervene in the form of a chance encounter with a little boy in a department store, a meeting that would force him to confront not just his present loneliness, but the pieces of his past he'd left behind in his relentless climb to the top. Oliver Whitman was different from the other second graders at Franklin Elementary School, and not just because he was often the last child picked up from after-school care. At 7 years old, he carried himself with a peculiar mix of childhood innocence and premature maturity that came from watching his mother fight daily battles most kids couldn't understand. His teacher, Ms. Thompson, often found him during lunch breaks, nose buried in library books while other children played outside. When asked why he wasn't joining them, Oliver would smile his mother's smile and say he was studying to become smart enough to help Mom pay the bills. The response always made Ms. Thompson's heart ache. The other children weren't always kind. During Parent Career Day, when Oliver couldn't explain what his father did because he went away, Tommy Miller had loudly announced that Oliver's dad probably left because they were poor. That night, Grace found her son trying to count the money in his piggy bank, asking if they had enough to make his dad come back. Despite their struggles, the bond between Oliver and Grace was extraordinary. Their small apartment might have lacked expensive toys and gadgets, but it was filled with love and creativity. Every night, no matter how exhausted she was from her double shifts, Grace would sit with Oliver for adventure time. Together they'd create stories using household items. A blanket became a superhero cape, wooden spoons transformed into magic wands, and the worn couch cushions could build any fortress imaginable. Oliver had inherited his mother's sharp mind and quiet resilience. He noticed things other children might miss, like how Grace would skip meals when money was tight, claiming she'd already eaten at work, or how she'd stay up late sewing patches on his clothes to make them last another season. He learned to be careful with his belongings and never asked for expensive things, even when the other kids showed off their new toys. The headache started shortly after his 7th birthday. At first, Grace thought it was eye strain from reading in dim light, but when Oliver began having trouble keeping his balance during their living room dance parties, she knew something was wrong. The free clinic doctor looked concerned, but said they needed tests that Grace couldn't afford. That night, Oliver pretended to be asleep while his mother made desperate phone calls, trying to find a way to pay for medical care. Mrs. Callahan became like a grandmother to Oliver, watching him after school when Grace worked late. She taught him to play chess and told him stories about his mother's high school days when Grace had been the smartest student in her class. Oliver treasured these stories, especially the ones about how kind and helpful his mother had always been. It helped him understand why she still stopped to help Mrs. Jenkins from the 3rd floor with her groceries, even when they were running late. Every night before bed, Oliver would watch his mother when she thought he was sleeping. She would sit at their small kitchen table, sometimes looking at an old photograph she kept hidden under her pillow. He'd discovered it was a picture of a young man from her high school yearbook, someone named Ethan Caldwell. On those nights he'd see his mother smile, a different kind of smile, one that made him wonder about dreams and love and all the things his young heart sensed but couldn't quite understand. Despite everything, the whispers at school, the worried nights, the missing father, Oliver knew one thing with absolute certainty: his mother's love was the strongest force in the world. He'd seen her move mountains with nothing but determination and grace, and even at 7, he was determined to become someone worthy of her sacrifices. The Marshall Sons department store buzzed with pre-Christmas energy, its aisles crowded with shoppers seeking last-minute gifts. Amid the chaos, Oliver clutched his carefully saved $10 bill, earned from weeks of helping Mrs. Callahan with her recycling and errands. The money felt like a fortune in his small hands, enough, he hoped, to buy his mother something special for Christmas. Mrs. Callahan guided him through the bustling store, her arthritis making her steps slow but steady. "Stay close, dear," she reminded him, though her words were nearly lost in the symphony of holiday music and chattering shoppers. Oliver nodded, but his attention was already captured by the display of snow globes near the center aisle. One particular globe caught his eye, a small, delicate piece featuring a mother and child ice skating together. It wasn't the most elaborate or expensive, but something about it reminded him of the stories his mother told about learning to ice skate as a girl. The price tag read $9.99, almost exactly what he had saved. Lost in contemplation of the snow globe, Oliver didn't notice the tall figure approaching until they collided. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his precious $10 bill nearly slipping from his grasp. Looking up and up some more, Oliver found himself face to face with a man in an impeccable suit who seemed to command the very air around him. "I'm so sorry," Sir Oliver stammered, clutching his money tighter. But as he studied the man's face, recognition dawned. Those features were familiar. He'd seen them countless times in the photograph his mother kept hidden, though the man before him was older now, his face marked by years and responsibility. The man Ethan Caldwell, Oliver realized with a jolt, crouched down to his level, genuine concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice kind despite his imposing appearance. That was quite a bump, but Oliver couldn't help himself. The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "Hey, I know you. You're the man from the picture under my mom's pillow." The statement hung in the air between them, drawing curious glances from nearby shoppers. Ethan's expression shifted from concern to surprise, then to something more complex. "Under her pillow," he repeated, as if testing the words. "Yes, Sir," Oliver continued, emboldened by the man's gentle tone. "Mom looks at it sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping. She gets this sad smile, like when she's remembering something nice but missing it too." He paused, then added with childlike certainty, "It's you when you were younger. Mom said your name once, Ethan Caldwell." Ethan's composed demeanor cracked slightly, revealing a flash of vulnerability. "And your mother is?" "Grace Whitman," Oliver said proudly. "Well, she says it's Grace Whitman again now, not Crawford anymore." He noticed how the man's expression changed at his mother's name, something flickering in his eyes that Oliver couldn't quite understand. Mrs. Callahan had caught up by now, her eyes widening as she recognized the CEO, whose picture regularly appeared in the business section of her morning newspaper. "Oliver, sweetheart, we shouldn't bother Mr. Caldwell," she began, but Ethan held up a gentle hand. "It's no bother at all," he assured her, though his eyes remained fixed on Oliver. "I'm very interested in speaking with Grace's son." The way he said Grace was different from how most people spoke, softer somehow, like the name itself was precious. Before Oliver could say more, Mrs. Callahan was guiding him away, apologizing for the interruption. But as they moved toward the checkout counter, Oliver turned back one last time. He saw Ethan Caldwell still standing there, looking lost in thought, the busy store seeming to fade away around him. The man reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and began dialing with purpose. Oliver smiled, clutching his snow globe and $10 bill. Something told him this wasn't the last time he'd see the man from his mother's photograph. That evening, Gracie's hands trembled as she counted her tips at Rosie's diner, the worn bills spreading across the counter like fallen leaves. The lunch rush had been brutal, and her feet ached from 10 hours of continuous movement. $23.40, not nearly enough to cover Oliver's growing medical expenses. The headaches had become more frequent, and the free clinic's referral to a neurologist lay heavy in her purse. Its estimated cost more than she made in 2 months. Her son's health insurance application had been denied again, another casualty of her complicated divorce situation. Thomas's lawyers had made sure of that, tying up the paperwork in endless red tape. Grace, Honey Mabel, the senior waitress, called from the kitchen. Table 6 needs their check, and 7 just got seated. Grace quickly tucked the bills into her apron, pushing aside her worries to paste on her professional smile. The couple at table 7 turned out to be regulars from the Crawford Country Club people who once attended her wedding. They pretended not to recognize her as she took their order, but she caught their whispered comments as she walked away. After her shift ended at the diner, Grace rushed across town to her evening job at Marshall Financial's office building. The cleaning company paid minimum wage, but the night hours meant she could be home when Oliver woke up. Tonight, as she emptied trash bins and wiped down desks, her eyes kept straying to the framed degrees on the walls dreams she'd once held for herself. The cleaning cart squeaked as she pushed it down the empty hallway, her reflection ghosting along the darkened windows. A sharp pain shot through her lower back, a reminder of the fall she'd taken last week rushing between jobs. The emergency room had been out of the question. She'd made do with ice packs and borrowed pain pills from Mrs. Callahan. At midnight, Grace finally unlocked their apartment door to find Mrs. Callahan dozing in the armchair, her knitting needles still in her lap. Oliver's homework lay completed on the table, alongside a drawing he'd made, a family portrait that included a conspicuously absent father figure. "He was asking about Thomas again," Mrs. Callahan whispered as Grace helped her up. "Some kids at school were talking about their dads coming to career day." The older woman hesitated, then added, "He tried to wait up for you, dear," said his head was hurting again. Grace's heart clenched as she peeked into Oliver's room. Her son slept curled around his old teddy bear, his face peaceful despite the worry lines that sometimes creased his young forehead. The bottle of children's pain reliever on his nightstand was almost empty, another expense she'd have to somehow cover. Back in the kitchen, Grace pulled out her carefully maintained budget book. The numbers refused to add up no matter how she juggled them. Rent, utilities, food, medication, even working 7 days a week, she was barely staying afloat. The latest letter from Thomas's lawyers threatened to revoke her custody agreement if she couldn't provide adequate financial stability. A sudden wave of exhaustion hit her, and Grace found herself pulling out the photographs she kept hidden. Ethan Caldwell's young face smiled up at her, reminding her of a time when possibilities seemed endless. She'd read about his success in the business pages, watching from afar as he built his empire. Sometimes on her darkest nights she imagined running into him, telling him how his quiet kindness in high school had meant more than he knew. The sound of Oliver coughing snapped her back to reality. Grace quickly tucked the photo away and headed to check on her son, ignoring the growing pain in her back and the mounting bills on the table. Tomorrow would be another day of smiling through gritted teeth, of making impossible choices, of being strong because there was no other option. For Oliver, she would find a way. She always did. Back in his penthouse office, Ethan sat behind his mahogany desk, the city lights twinkling below like earthbound stars. The encounter with Oliver had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Grace Whitman, a name he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years, yet one that had never truly left him. "Margaret," he spoke into the intercom, "I need everything you can find on Grace Whitman, formerly Grace Crawford. And I mean everything. His trusted assistant's acknowledgement was immediate, though he detected a note of curiosity in her voice. It wasn't like him to make personal requests. Within hours, a comprehensive file appeared on his desk. Margaret's efficiency was legendary, and she hadn't disappointed. The documents told a story that made Ethan's jaw clench with growing anger. Grace's marriage to Thomas Crawford, the suspicious transfer of assets, the bitter divorce, the ongoing custody battles, it was all there in black and white. "There's more," Margaret said, standing in his doorway. "She works 2 jobs: waitress at Rosie's Diner and night cleaner at Marshall Financial. Her son, Oliver, has been showing symptoms that require neurological evaluation, but their insurance application keeps getting blocked. The Crawford family's influence runs deep in this city." Ethan remembered Grace from high school, brilliant, kind, with a quiet strength that had drawn him even then. He'd wanted to ask her to prom, had even worked up the courage, only to learn she'd already accepted Thomas Crawford's invitation. The memory still stung, though he'd never admitted it to anyone. "Pull up the Crawford family's business records," he instructed, a plan forming in his mind. "I want to know every company they're involved with, every board they sit on, every charity they claim to support." As Margaret worked her magic, patterns began to emerge, patterns that suggested the Crawfords' wealth wasn't as cleanly earned as they pretended. A particular document caught his eye, an anonymous email that had saved Caldwell Enterprises from a devastating merger 2 years ago. The writing style was familiar, the insights brilliant yet understated. "Cross-reference this with Grace's old academic records," he requested, his suspicion growing. The confirmation came near midnight. The anonymous whistleblower who had prevented his company's hostile takeover had been Grace. She had recognized the Crawford family's signature tactics and warned him, without ever revealing her identity or asking for anything in return. Ethan stood at his window, watching snow begin to fall over the city. In one evening, his carefully ordered world had shifted on its axis. Grace Whitman wasn't just a memory anymore. She was a flesh and blood woman fighting battles he could barely imagine, raising a remarkable son, and still finding ways to help others, even when she had nothing to spare. "Margaret," he called again, his decision made. "Send an invitation to the Christmas gala to Grace Whitman. Add a personal note from me. And find out which neurologist is the best in the city for pediatric cases." He paused, then added, "Also, I want a complete review of our company's hiring practices and scholarship programs." As his assistant left to carry out his instructions, Ethan found himself thinking about the photograph Oliver had mentioned. Grace had kept his picture all these years, looking at it in private moments of sadness. The thought stirred something in him, a mixture of hope and regret that demanded action. Opening his desk drawer, he pulled out his own worn high school yearbook. Grace's senior photo smiled up at him, her eyes full of the same quiet determination he'd seen reflected in her son. He had built an empire of glass and steel, but she had preserved something far more precious: her integrity, her compassion, her capacity to love despite everything life had thrown at her. The snow fell harder outside his window as Ethan began to plan. He had resources, influence, and a growing determination to right some very old wrongs. What he didn't know was that fate had already set larger wheels in motion, and the coming days would test them all in ways none of them could anticipate. The pediatric wing of City General Hospital was painted in cheerful colors that did nothing to mask its institutional nature. Grace sat rigidly in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Oliver lay on the examination table, his small frame dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. The headaches had gotten worse, and this morning he had collapsed during breakfast. Dr. Sarah Peterson studied the preliminary test results with a furrowed brow. The free clinic doctor had called in a personal favor to get them seen immediately, bypassing the usual waiting lists. "Mrs. Whitman," she began gently, "Oliver's symptoms indicate a condition that requires immediate attention. The MRI shows a benign tumor pressing against his optical nerve." Grace felt the room spin. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. A tumor. "It's operable," Dr. Peterson continued, her tone professional yet compassionate. "But we need to act quickly. The pressure is causing his headaches and affecting his balance. If left untreated, it could impact his vision permanently." Oliver reached for his mother's hand, his small fingers intertwining with hers. Even at 7, he seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "Is that why I keep seeing funny colors, Dr. Peterson?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The doctor nodded, impressed by his composure. "Yes, Oliver, that's exactly why. But we're going to help fix that." She turned back to Grace, lowering her voice. "The surgery needs to happen within the next 2 weeks. I understand there are insurance complications." Grace's throat tightened. The estimated cost of the surgery floated before her eyes, more money than she'd make in 5 years. "I'll find a way," she managed, though she had no idea how. "Whatever it takes." Dr. Peterson hesitated, then pulled out a business card. "There's a charitable foundation that sometimes helps with cases like this. I can't make any promises, but I'll put in a word. In the meantime, we'll start the paperwork for financial assistance." The ride home was quiet, Oliver dozing in the back seat of their aging car while Grace's mind raced through possibilities. She could sell everything they owned, work extra shifts, beg for advances from both jobs. It still wouldn't be enough. The thought of approaching Thomas made her stomach turn. He would use this to try to take Oliver away. But that evening, after tucking Oliver into bed with an extra dose of pain medication, Grace sat at their kitchen table surrounded by medical bills and bank statements. Mrs. Callahan had brought over a casserole and offered to loan them her life savings, an act of kindness that had brought Grace to tears. Mum Oliver's voice came from the hallway. He stood there in his Superman pajamas, clutching his teddy bear. "Are you crying because of me?" Grace quickly wiped her eyes, opening her arms. Oliver climbed into her lap, though he was getting almost too big for it. "No, baby. I'm crying because I love you so much, and sometimes love just spills over." "I saw you looking at Mr. Caldwell's picture again," he said quietly. "Maybe he could help. He seemed nice at the store." Grace stroked his hair, remembering their brief encounter years ago when Ethan had defended her during a debate competition. He had been kind then, but they lived in different worlds now. "Sometimes grown-up things are complicated, sweetheart. But don't worry, Mommy will figure something out. I always do, right?" Oliver nodded against her shoulder, already growing drowsy again from the medication. "You're stronger than Superman," he murmured as she carried him back to bed. Later that night, Grace pulled out her laptop, a refurbished model Oliver used for schoolwork. With trembling fingers, she began typing an email to Caldwell Enterprises' general inquiry address. She had sworn never to ask for help, to handle everything on her own, but Oliver's life was worth more than her pride. The words came slowly, each one carefully chosen. She explained their situation without self-pity, attaching copies of Oliver's medical records and the hospital's cost estimates. Just before clicking send, she added a personal note: "You may not remember me, but your kindness once meant everything to a girl who needed to believe in herself. Now I'm asking for kindness again, not for myself, but for my son." Her finger hovered over the mouse. In the other room, Oliver's cough echoed through their small apartment. Grace closed her eyes, said a prayer, and clicked send. Grace moved through Rosie's diner like a ghost during the morning rush, her mind far from the clinking plates and coffee orders. She had spent the night researching medical loans, but her credit score, destroyed during the divorce, closed every conventional door. The weight of Dr. Peterson's diagnosis pressed heavily on her shoulders. 2 weeks to find a way to save her son's sight. During her break, she sat in the storage room making calls. 3 pawn shops had already given her quotes for her wedding ring, the only valuable thing she'd kept from her marriage to Thomas. The highest offer was $2,000, barely a dent in the hospital bill, but enough for the initial consultation fee. "You look dead on your feet," Honey Mabel commented, sliding her an extra portion of toast during lunch. "Eat something." The older waitress hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Listen, my brother works security at the casino. Says they're always looking for cocktail waitresses. Tips are better than here." Grace's hands trembled around her coffee cup. The casino meant late nights, revealing uniforms, and the kind of attention she'd spent years avoiding. But the tips could be hundreds per night, money that could help save Oliver. Could you? Could you maybe talk to your brother? After her diner shift, Grace drove to Marshall Financial, where she cleaned offices at night. As she emptied trash bins, she noticed a memo about an upcoming charity auction. Local businesses were donating services and items to benefit children's causes. Her fingers tightened around the paper as an idea formed. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by old notebooks from high school. Her academic awards might be gathering dust, but her mind was still sharp. She had secretly been helping Mrs. Callahan manage finances for several small businesses in the building, turning struggling operations into profitable ones. With trembling hands, Grace created a business proposal, financial consulting services for small businesses, offered through the charity auction. She could help others while raising money for Oliver's surgery. It was a desperate gamble, but she had to try. Between shifts the next day, Grace visited 3 banks, attempting to secure a medical loan. Each rejection felt like a physical blow. The last banker, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked at her apologetically. "Mrs. Whitman, with these credit issues and the pending legal matters from your divorce, I just can't help. Have you considered reaching out to your ex-husband?" The suggestion made her stomach turn. Thomas would use Oliver's condition to force her back into their old life, back under the Crawfords' control. She'd rather sell everything they owned than give them that power again. That night, Grace took inventory of their possessions. Her laptop could fetch a few $100s. Her mother's antique brooch, the only family heirloom she had left, might bring in another 1,000. She started listing items on various online marketplaces, pricing pieces of their life like items in a garage sale. The breaking point came when Oliver asked about his beloved telescope, a birthday gift from Mrs. Callahan. "We could sell it," Mommy offered bravely, though his voice quivered. "I know it's worth something and I don't need it right now anyway. Not until my eyes get better." Grace pulled him close, fighting back tears. "No, baby. That's your special star watching telescope. We're not selling that, but later, after Oliver was asleep, she photographed the telescope anyway, adding it to her growing list of last resorts." A call from Dr. Peterson's office brought more pressure. They had an opening for surgery in 10 days. They needed a deposit to hold the slot. Grace thanked them professionally, then locked herself in the bathroom and silently screamed into a towel. That evening, she did something she'd sworn never to do. She pulled out the old yearbook and carefully removed Ethan's photograph. On the back, in faded ink, was his family's old address. The Caldwells had been wealthy, but never cruel like the Crawfords. Maybe if she wrote a letter explaining everything. Grace stared at the photo until her vision blurred. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Caldwell was probably sitting in his penthouse office, unaware that a desperate mother was considering begging for his help. The thought made her cheeks burn with shame, but Oliver's need outweighed her pride. She began to write, pouring her heart onto paper, knowing this letter might be her last hope for saving their son. Outside their apartment window, the city lights twinkled indifferently, while inside, a mother's love waged war against impossible odds. In his penthouse office, Ethan sat surrounded by stacks of documents, his usual pristine desk now a maze of paper trails and financial records. For 3 days straight, he had been obsessively reviewing every major decision that had saved Caldwell Enterprises over the past 5 years. Something about Grace's email had triggered a memory, a connection he couldn't quite place. "Margaret," he called through the intercom, "bring me the Henderson merger files from 2 years ago." His assistant appeared moments later, carrying a thick folder that had gathered dust in the archives. Inside was the anonymous email that had prevented what would have been a catastrophic acquisition. Ethan read the message again, this time paying attention not to the content but to the writing style. The precise analytical approach, the subtle way of presenting complex information, the ethical considerations woven throughout it all screamed Grace Whitman. He remembered her writing style from their shared advanced placement classes, how she could break down the most complicated concepts into clear, compelling arguments. Cross-reference this email with Grace's academic records, he instructed Margaret, and find me every anonymous tip or analysis our company has received in the past 5 years. As his assistant worked, Ethan pulled up Grace's recent email about Oliver's condition. The same careful structure, the same thoughtful approach to presenting difficult information. The evidence began piling up. 3 years ago, an anonymous source had warned them about irregularities in a partner company's books, saving them from a major scandal. 2 years ago, the Henderson merger warning. Last year, a detailed analysis of market vulnerabilities that had helped them weather an economic downturn. All written in the same distinctive style. Sir Margaret appeared in his doorway, holding another file. "I found something interesting. Remember that consulting firm we nearly hired last year? The one that suddenly withdrew their bid? Their entire strategy was based on a free analysis they received from an unknown source. The analysis warned them that partnering with us would expose their questionable business practices." Ethan's hands tightened on his desk. The consulting firm had been secretly owned by the Crawfords. It would have given them access to Caldwell Enterprises' internal operations. Grace had saved his company multiple times without ever taking credit or asking for anything in return. He pulled up the hospital bills attached to Grace's recent email. The amount that seemed insignificant to his corporate budget represented years of struggle for her. Yet she had never used her knowledge of business vulnerabilities for personal gain, never attempted to blackmail or exploit the information she had. "Margaret," Ethan's voice was tight with emotion, "get me everything you can find on Thomas Crawford's current business dealings. And contact Dr. Peterson at City General. I want to know exactly what Oliver needs and when." His assistant paused at the door. "Sir, there's one more thing. We found a pattern in the Crawford family's charitable foundations. They've been systematically blocking grant applications from certain individuals. Grace Whitman's name appears on every rejection list." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. The Crawfords hadn't just abandoned Grace, they had actively worked to keep her trapped in poverty, all while she continued to anonymously protect others from their predatory business practices. Sitting back in his chair, Ethan remembered the quiet girl from high school who had always stood up for what was right. While he had built his empire focused solely on success, she had maintained her integrity through years of hardship. She had protected his company while fighting for survival, never compromising her principles, even when it could have solved all her problems. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the week," he instructed Margaret, "and contact our legal team. I want to know every option we have for dealing with the Crawfords." He paused, then added, "And Margaret, set up a meeting with our foundation's board of directors. It's time we reviewed our grant approval process." As night fell over the city, Ethan stood at his window, Grace's email glowing on his computer screen behind him. She had saved him without ever expecting recognition or reward. Now it was his turn to help her. Not out of pity or obligation, but because she had proven herself to be exactly who he remembered, someone who made the world better simply by being in it. The snow was falling again, coating the city in white. Somewhere out there, Grace was probably working her second job, unaware that her years of anonymous assistance had finally been discovered. Ethan made a silent promise to the night sky this time. Things would be different. This time he wouldn't let her face the battle alone. Thomas Crawford's Lexus pulled up outside Rosie's diner like a shark gliding into peaceful waters. Through the streaked window, Grace saw him step out, his expensive wool coat a stark contrast to the weathered building. Her hands froze on the coffee pot she'd been refilling, memories of their last encounter sending ice through her veins. "Well, well," Thomas's voice carried across the diner as he approached the counter, causing several regular customers to look up from their meals. "Still serving coffee, I see. How?" Fitting his smile didn't reach his eyes, which were fixed on Grace with calculated intensity. "What do you want?" Thomas. Grace kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She hadn't seen him in person since the divorce, their communication restricted to lawyers and threatening letters. He pulled out a manila envelope, placing it deliberately on the counter. "I heard about Oliver's condition. A brain tumor? And you didn't think his father should know?" The false concern in his voice made Grace's skin crawl. "You gave up the right to know when you abandoned us," she replied quietly, conscious of the other customers pretending not to listen. The court documents were quite clear about that. Thomas's practiced smile tightened. "Yes, about those court documents. My lawyers have prepared a petition for emergency custody modification. Given Oliver's medical needs and your obvious financial limitations, we believe it's in his best interest to live with me." Grace's world tilted sideways. She gripped the edge of the counter to stay upright, her knuckles turning white. "You can't do this. You haven't even seen him in 3 years." "I can, and I will." Thomas leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The Crawfords have the best medical team in the country on retainer. Oliver would receive immediate treatment at private facilities. No waiting lists, no financial concerns. Can you offer him that, Grace?" The coffee pot trembled in Grace's hand. Behind her, she could hear Mabel on the phone, probably calling their manager. The morning regulars were all watching now, their breakfast forgotten. "He's my son." Grace's voice cracked slightly. "You can't just walk back into his life because it suddenly suits you." Thomas's expression hardened. "He's my son too, though you've done your best to make him forget that. Did you really think I wouldn't find out about his condition? That my family wouldn't notice when you started asking around for medical loans?" He slid the envelope closer. "Inside you'll find 2 options. Option 1, sign over temporary custody to me, and Oliver gets the surgery next week at Crawford Memorial Hospital. All expenses covered, plus a generous monthly support payment for you." Grace's throat tightened. "And option 2? I take this to court. My lawyers will demonstrate that you're unable to provide adequate medical care. They'll bring up your multiple jobs, your housing situation, the fact that you leave him with an elderly neighbor most nights. How do you think that will look to a judge?" The diner had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their usual clattering to watch the scene unfold. Grace could feel the weight of their pity, their helplessness in the face of such calculated cruelty. "Oliver needs his mother," Grace managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oliver needs surgery," Thomas countered coldly. "Surgery you can't afford. Face it, Grace, you're in over your head. Do the right thing for once. Sign the papers." Grace's hand moved toward the envelope, then stopped. A memory flashed through her mind, Oliver's face the last time Thomas had disappointed him, the way he'd tried to hide his tears during yet another cancelled visit. "No," she said, straightening her spine. "I won't let you use his illness to control us again. Get out." Thomas's facade cracked for a moment, revealing the anger beneath. "Don't be stupid, Grace. You know how this ends. The Crawfords always win." "Is that why you're really here?" Grace asked, sudden clarity cutting through her fear. "Because you found out someone else might help us? Because you can't stand the idea of losing control?" His expression confirmed her suspicion. News of her contact with Ethan must have reached the Crawford family, triggering this sudden reappearance of paternal concern. "You have 24 hours to reconsider," Thomas said, his voice cold. "After that, we do this the hard way." He turned to leave, then added over his shoulder, "Oh, and Grace, I'd start looking for a new job. I hear this place might be changing ownership soon." After he left, the diner remained silent for a long moment. Then Mabel stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Grace, as the younger woman's composure finally cracked. Other regulars approached, offering words of support and outrage. But Grace barely heard them. Her mind was racing, calculating options she didn't have, searching for a way to protect her son from both the tumor threatening his health and the father threatening their family. When her shift ended, she found another envelope tucked under her windshield wiper, photographs of Oliver at school, at Mrs. Callahan's, even at his recent doctor's appointment. The message was clear the Crawfords were watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. Grace drove home in a daze, the custody papers burning a hole in her bag. She had 24 hours to find a miracle, or she would lose everything she had fought so hard to protect. The fluorescent lights of legal aid buzzed overhead as Grace sat clutching a stack of documents, waiting for her appointment. Oliver dozed in the chair beside her, his face pale and drawn from another night of headaches. The custody papers from Thomas felt like lead in her purse, the 24-hour deadline ticking away with each passing minute. Mrs. Whitman, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, appeared in the doorway. "I'm Linda Martinez." "Let's talk about your situation." The attorney's office was cramped but orderly, with towering stacks of case files suggesting a heavy workload. Grace explained everything while Linda took notes, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "The Crawfords are known for their aggressive legal tactics," she admitted. "They've donated heavily to most judges' election campaigns. Finding someone impartial won't be easy." Oliver's whimper interrupted their discussion. Grace rushed to his side, helping him to the bathroom where he was sick again, a new symptom that Dr. Peterson had warned would worsen without treatment. When they returned, Linda was reviewing Thomas's custody petition with a deep frown. "They're painting you as negligent for not seeking immediate treatment," she said, conveniently ignoring the fact that they've blocked every attempt you've made to secure funding. Classic Crawford strategy: create an impossible situation, then blame the victim for failing to overcome it. Grace dabbed Oliver's forehead with a damp paper towel. "Can they really take him from me?" "Not without a fight," Linda assured her, "but we need to move fast. First, we document everything, every medical appointment, every attempt to get financial assistance, every time Thomas missed scheduled visitation. Then we file our own emergency petition for full custody and increased support." The next 48 hours became a blur of activity. Grace took emergency leave from both jobs, using the time to gather evidence. Mrs. Callahan provided a detailed affidavit about Thomas's years of absence. Dr. Peterson documented Oliver's medical history and Grace's consistent efforts to seek treatment. But the Crawfords struck back hard. Suddenly, Grace's landlord served an eviction notice, claiming lease violations. The diner owner received multiple health code complaints. Even Oliver's school called about anonymous concerns regarding his attendance. "They're trying to destabilize your life," Linda explained during a rushed meeting between court filings. "Make you look unreliable, push you into making mistakes. We need to show the judge who's really acting in Oliver's best interest." Through it all, Oliver's condition continued to deteriorate. His headaches became more frequent, and his right eye began to show signs of vision loss. Grace spent nights holding him through the pain, singing the lullabies of his childhood, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of his suffering. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. Thursday night, Grace sat at their kitchen table preparing the documentation Linda had requested. Oliver's medical records, her financial statements, the threatening letters from Thomas's lawyers, each piece told part of their story. Mum Oliver appeared in his pajamas, squinting against even the dim kitchen light. "Are they going to take me away?" Grace's heart shattered. She pulled him into her lap, though he was almost too big for it now. "No, baby, I won't let that happen. You and me, we're a team, remember?" "But Dad," said Oliver, hesitated. "He came to school today. Said I'd have my own room at his house, and video games, and I'd get better doctors." Grace stiffened. Thomas had violated the current custody agreement by contacting Oliver without permission. "What did you tell him?" "I said I wanted to stay with you." Oliver buried his face in her shoulder. He got mad, said you were being selfish, keeping me sick, because you couldn't afford doctors. Anger flared in Grace's chest, but she kept her voice calm. Listen to me, Oliver. Your father, he has a way of twisting things, making people doubt themselves. But I promise you, everything I've done, every choice I've made, has been to protect you and keep you safe. I know, Mum, Oliver whispered. That's what I told him too. Grace held her son tighter, feeling his slight frame tremble against her. Tomorrow they would face Thomas and his army of lawyers. Tomorrow they would fight for their family in a system that seemed stacked against them. But for now, in their small kitchen, with its flickering light and stack of worried bills, they had each other, and Grace swore silently that it would stay that way no matter what it took. When Oliver finally fell asleep, Grace returned to her paperwork with renewed determination. She had survived Thomas's abuse, the Crawfords' manipulation, years of poverty and struggle. She would survive this too. She had to her son's future depended on it. Ethan paced his office, the city lights twinkling beyond his windows like distant stars. On his desk lay 2 documents, Grace's custody hearing notification and a contract worth billions with Crawford Industries. His board of directors had been pursuing this deal for months, but now the timing felt like a deliberate threat. The Crawfords are offering a 15% premium above market value, Margaret reported, watching her boss's unusual display of agitation. But there's a condition we have to sign before the custody hearing tomorrow morning. Ethan stopped at the window, his reflection grim in the darkened glass. They know, he said quietly. About Grace's email, about my investigation into their business practices. This is Thomas Crawford's way of forcing my hand. The choice seemed impossible. Supporting Grace meant potentially sacrificing a deal that would boost Caldwell Enterprises' stock by 30%. His shareholders would revolt. The board might even challenge his leadership. Yet the thought of abandoning Grace and Oliver to the Crawfords' manipulation made him physically ill. Pull up everything we have on Crawford Industries, he instructed Margaret. Every transaction, every merger, every charitable donation. There's a pattern here we're missing. As they dug deeper into the records, a disturbing picture emerged. The Crawfords had a history of using their children's medical needs as leverage in custody battles. 3 former Crawford wives had lost custody after their children developed serious illnesses that mysteriously improved once the Crawfords gained control. It's a pattern of medical manipulation, Margaret realized, spreading the documents across Ethan's desk. They wait until the child needs expensive treatment, then swoop in as saviors while portraying the mothers as negligent. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. And now they're doing it to Grace, the same Grace who had anonymously protected his company, who had maintained her integrity through years of hardship, who had chosen poverty over compromising her principles. His phone buzzed another message from the board demanding an answer about the Crawford contract. The deal would secure his company's future, cement his legacy as CEO. It was the logical choice, the business choice. But Ethan remembered Oliver's earnest face in the department store, the way he'd spoken about his mother with such love and pride. He thought about Grace, fighting alone against a system rigged against her, still finding ways to help others even when she had nothing to spare. Margaret, he said finally, contact our legal team. I want them at that custody hearing tomorrow, and get me everything we have on Judge Harrison's connection to the Crawford family. Sir Margaret hesitated. The board won't approve using company resources for a personal matter. Then I'll pay for it myself, Ethan's voice was firm. And Margaret, cancel tomorrow's board meeting. I'll be in court. Late that night, Ethan sat in his penthouse reviewing the evidence they'd gathered. His decision would cost him professionally, there was no doubt about that. The Crawfords' influence ran deep in the business world, and they were not known for forgiveness. But as he looked at the photograph of young Grace from their yearbook, he knew he'd made the right choice. Success meant nothing if it came at the cost of watching good people suffer. His parents had taught him that before they died, a lesson he'd somehow forgotten in his pursuit of corporate power. A text message lit up his phone. Emergency board meeting called for 8 a.m. Attendance mandatory. The timing wasn't coincidental. The custody hearing started at 9. The board would try to force his hand, make him choose between his company and his conscience. Ethan smiled grimly as he typed his response, "I won't be attending. Proceed without me." Then he turned back to the evidence, preparing for tomorrow's battle. Some things were worth risking everything for, and stopping the Crawfords' pattern of destruction was one of them. As dawn broke over the city, Ethan straightened his tie and gathered the files. His driver was already waiting to take him to the courthouse. He might lose his company over this decision, but for the first time in years he felt truly alive. Tomorrow's business headlines would be brutal, but somewhere across the city, a little boy was counting on him. And this time he wouldn't let profit win over principle. The pediatric ward of City General Hospital buzzed with its usual morning activity as Grace sat beside Oliver's bed, watching him sleep. The preliminary tests for his surgery were scheduled to begin in an hour, a small victory won at the custody hearing thanks to Ethan's unexpected intervention. Thomas had been furious when the judge ordered joint medical decision-making, his mask of paternal concern slipping to reveal raw anger. Mrs. Whitman, a nurse, appeared at the door. "We need you at the registration desk. There's an issue with the insurance paperwork." Grace hesitated, looking at Oliver's peaceful face. "It'll just take a few minutes," the nurse assured her. "He's in good hands." Grace pressed a gentle kiss to Oliver's forehead before following the nurse down the sterile hallway. The registration desk was around the corner, but when they arrived, the clerk looked confused. "I haven't called for any patients," she said. Grace's heart dropped as she spun around, but the nurse who had fetched her was gone. She ran back to Oliver's room, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. The bed was empty, the sheets still warm. His backpack with the teddy bear was gone, along with his clothes. A security guard appeared, responding to Grace's panicked cries. "A man just left with a young boy," another nurse reported, rushing up. Said he was the father, showed paperwork. They went down the service elevator, but Grace's world tilted sideways. "Thomas," she whispered. "He's taking Oliver." Her phone was already in her hand, dialing 911 as she ran toward the stairs. Behind her, she could hear the security guard radioing for backup, calling for a lockdown. In the parking garage, Grace caught a glimpse of Thomas's black Lexus pulling away, Oliver's small face visible in the back window. Her son's eyes met hers for a brief moment, wide with fear and confusion, before the car disappeared into traffic. "He's not stable enough to be moved," she told the police officer who arrived minutes later. "The tumor, any stress could cause complications. Please, you have to find them." But Thomas had planned well. The paperwork he'd shown the hospital staff was expertly forged, claiming full emergency custody. His lawyer was already filing motions claiming Grace had become unstable and a danger to the child's medical care. Grace paced the hospital corridor, her phone pressed to her ear as she called everyone who might help. Mrs. Callahan was checking their apartment in case Thomas took Oliver there. Linda Martinez was filing emergency motions with the court. But it was the call to Ethan that brought immediate action. "I've got my security team tracking his credit cards and cell phone." Ethan's voice was taut with controlled anger. "The Crawfords own property all over the city. He has to be taking Oliver to one of their facilities." Hours passed like years. Oliver's doctors were frantic. He needed to stay under observation. His condition was too delicate for travel. Police cars scoured the city while Grace remained at the hospital, torn between staying in case Thomas brought Oliver back and searching herself. Her phone rang an unknown number. Mom Oliver's voice was weak, frightened. "Dad says we're going to his special hospital, but I don't feel good. Everything's spinning." "Oliver, baby, where are you? Can you see anything outside?" Trees. Lots of trees. And a big gate with the phone went dead. Grace's hands shook as she called Ethan. "The Crawford estate," he said immediately. It's the only property they have with that description. I'm already on my way. Meet me there. The Crawford estate stood like a fortress on the outskirts of the city, its wrought iron gates and high walls designed to keep people out or in. Grace arrived to find Ethan's car already parked nearby, his driver keeping watch. There's an old service entrance, Ethan explained, leading her through the winter-dead gardens. My family used to attend parties here. I remember sneaking out as a teenager, he stopped as voices carried through the evening air. They crouched behind a hedge, watching as Thomas hurried across the front courtyard, carrying a limp Oliver in his arms. The boy's face was ghostly pale, his body completely still. Grace's scream pierced the winter twilight as she broke cover, running toward her son. Security guards appeared, but Ethan was faster, placing himself between Grace and the approaching men. His unconscious Grace reached for Oliver, her hands finding his burning forehead. He needs a hospital now. Thomas backed away, still holding Oliver. He's getting the best care money can buy. You're just hysterical. Put my son down, Grace's voice was steel. Or I swear to God, Thomas, what happens next will destroy everything your family has built. The city blurred past as Ethan's car sped through the gathering dusk, Grace clutching the dashboard with white-knuckled hands. Thomas had vanished with Oliver during the confrontation at the Crawford estate, using the family's private security team as cover for his escape. He has to be taking him to Crawford Memorial, Ethan said, his voice tight as he maneuvered through traffic. It's the only facility they control completely. His phone buzzed continuously with updates from his security team, tracking Thomas's movements through the city's network of traffic cameras. Grace's mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Oliver had been unconscious, his skin burning with fever symptoms Dr. Peterson had warned could indicate dangerous pressure from the tumor. Every minute they lost in this desperate chase could have devastating consequences. There, Grace pointed at a black Lexus 3 cars ahead. The same make and model as Thomas's, but when they drew closer, the license plate was wrong. Another dead end. They'd already chased 2 similar vehicles across the city, precious time slipping away with each false lead. Ethan's phone rang Margaret with an update. Sir, Crawford Memorial just initiated emergency protocols. They're clearing an entire floor. Security's been doubled at all entrances. He's taking him in through their private wing, Ethan realized, making a sharp turn that sent them heading toward the hospital's back entrance. The Crawfords use it for discreet treatments. No regular staff allowed, no questions asked. Grace's phone lit up with a text from Mrs. Callahan news vans outside Crawford Memorial. Thomas's lawyer making statement about mother's negligence and father's emergency intervention to save child's life. The message was followed by a photo of Thomas's lawyer addressing reporters, spinning their carefully crafted narrative. He planned this, Grace's voice broke. He waited until Oliver was at his weakest, most vulnerable moment, all to prove I couldn't protect him. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The Crawfords have done this before. They create impossible situations, then swoop in as saviors. But this time is different, he glanced at Grace. This time they didn't count on us working together. They pulled into the hospital's service area, where delivery trucks usually parked. Ethan's security team was already in position, having tracked Thomas's car to the private parking garage. He's taken Oliver to the 10th floor, the head of security reported. But they've locked down all access points. Grace started toward the service elevator, but Ethan caught her arm. Wait. Thomas will expect us to rush in. That's probably exactly what he wants, you looking desperate and unstable in front of witnesses. I don't care how it looks, Grace pulled away. My son is up there, sick, scared, with a man who's never put his needs first. Trust me, Ethan's voice was quiet but intense. I have a plan, but I need 5 minutes to put it in motion. Can you give me that? Those 5 minutes felt like an eternity as Grace watched Ethan make calls, his security team moving swiftly through the hospital. She could see the private wing's windows from where they stood, imagining Oliver alone and frightened behind one of them. Then everything happened at once. Hospital security responded to multiple false alarms throughout the building, drawing Thomas's private guards away from their posts. A medical emergency required immediate evacuation of 3 floors, creating chaos in the corridors. And in the confusion, Ethan's team accessed the service elevator's override controls. Now Ethan took Grace's hand. We go up together. My team has the security feeds looped. As far as Thomas knows, we're still searching the city. The service elevator carried them swiftly upward, Grace's heart pounding with each passing floor. When the doors opened, they found the private wing eerily quiet, its luxurious furnishings a stark contrast to the regular hospital floors below. Through a window in one of the treatment room doors, they finally spotted Oliver. He lay motionless on a bed, connected to monitors, while Thomas argued with a doctor in the corner. The doctor was shaking his head, gesturing at charts and readings that clearly troubled him. "Ready?" Ethan asked softly, his hand steady on Grace's shoulder. She nodded, drawing strength from his presence. Whatever happened next, she wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Oliver. The door to Oliver's treatment room burst open, Grace and Ethan striding in with purpose. Thomas spun around, his face contorting with rage. "How did you get in here?" "Security." "Your security team is rather busy at the moment." Ethan's voice was cold, professional. "And I believe you'll find your access to this hospital has been temporarily suspended." The private doctor backed away from the confrontation, clutching Oliver's charts. Grace rushed to her son's bedside, her hands gentle on his burning forehead. The monitors beeped ominously, displaying numbers that made her heart race. "You have no right to be here," Thomas snarled. "I'm protecting my son from your negligence. Look at these facilities the best money can buy. What can you offer him except more waiting lists and charity care?" "What I can offer him is a mother's love." Grace's voice was steady despite her trembling hands. "Something you've never understood, Thomas. You see him as a possession, a pawn in your games. But he's a child, our child, and he's suffering." The doctor cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Crawford, about the boy's condition. These readings are concerning. The pressure is increasing rapidly. He needs immediate intervention." "Then do something," Thomas demanded. "That's what I'm paying you for." "It's not that simple." The doctor stood his ground. "The original surgical team at City General has his complete history. Moving him here, interrupting the treatment plan, it's complicated an already delicate situation." Oliver stirred on the bed, his eyes fluttering open. Mommy's voice was barely a whisper. "My head hurts really bad." Grace leaned close, stroking his hair. "I'm here, baby. You're going to be okay." Step away from him, Thomas moved forward threateningly, but Ethan intercepted him. "Think carefully about your next move," Ethan warned. "Because right now you're facing kidnapping charges, medical endangerment, and fraud. Is that really the legacy you want to leave your son?" The sound of running footsteps in the hallway drew everyone's attention. Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, accompanied by 2 police officers and Linda Martinez. "This is a private facility," Thomas began, but Dr. Peterson cut him off. "This is a medical emergency," she snapped, moving swiftly to Oliver's bedside. Her face grew grave as she checked the monitors. "He needs surgery now. The pressure is reaching critical levels." "I demand," Thomas started, but one of the officers stepped forward. "Mr. Crawford, we have a warrant for your arrest. The kidnapping of a minor during medical treatment is a federal offense." Grace held Oliver's hand as chaos erupted around them. Thomas shouting about his rights, lawyers being called, security teams confronting each other in the hallway. Through it all, Dr. Peterson worked quickly, preparing Oliver for immediate transfer. Mum Oliver's voice was frighteningly weak. "I don't want to stay here. It's scary. It's scary." "We're leaving," sweetheart, Grace promised. Dr. Peterson is taking you back to City General. Everything's going to be all right now." As they wheeled Oliver toward the elevator, Thomas made one last desperate attempt. "You can't do this. I have rights." "Your rights," Grace turned to face him, years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. "What about Oliver's rights? His right to stability, to medical care without manipulation, to a father who loves him more than his own ego? You lost those rights the moment you turned our son's illness into a weapon." The elevator doors opened, and Dr. Peterson's team efficiently moved Oliver inside. Grace followed, but not before giving Thomas one final look. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers, and this time the truth about the Crawfords will come out. All of it." As the elevator descended, Grace felt Ethan's steady presence beside her. Oliver's hand was still clasped in hers, his breathing shallow but stable. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Thomas's arrest was just the beginning. There would be legal battles, media scrutiny, and most importantly, Oliver's surgery to face. But looking at Ethan's determined expression and feeling her son's trust in her touch, Grace knew they would face it all together. Sometimes the biggest victories came not from having the most money or power, but from having the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The surgical waiting room at City General felt smaller with each passing hour. Grace paced the worn linoleum floor, while Ethan sat quietly in one of the vinyl chairs, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled from the night's events. Dr. Peterson had rushed Oliver into emergency surgery the moment they returned from Crawford Memorial, the tumor's pressure having reached dangerous levels. The family of Oliver Whitman, a nurse, appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Dr. Peterson would like to speak with you." Grace felt her knees weaken, but Ethan was there instantly, his hand steady at her elbow as they followed the nurse down the fluorescent-lit corridor. They found Dr. Peterson in the surgical consultation room, still wearing her scrubs, looking exhausted. "There have been complications," she began without preamble. "The trauma of being moved during such a critical period has caused increased swelling. We're having difficulty accessing the tumor without risking damage to the surrounding tissue." Grace sank into a chair, her world narrowing to the doctor's next words. "What does that mean for Oliver?" "We need to stop the surgery for now," Dr. Peterson explained. "Let the swelling reduce before we attempt to remove the tumor." But she hesitated. "Time is not on our side. The pressure is affecting his optical nerve more severely than we initially thought." "How long?" Grace's voice cracked. "How long can we wait?" 48 hours, maximum. After that, the risk of permanent damage becomes significant. Dr. Peterson looked between Grace and Ethan. "There's an experimental procedure that might help reduce the swelling faster, but it's not covered by any insurance. The cost." "Whatever it costs," Ethan interrupted. "Just help him." They were allowed to see Oliver briefly in recovery. He looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and IV lines. His face was swollen, a pressure monitor protruding from his bandaged head. "Mum," his voice was barely audible. "Everything's dark. Why is it so dark?" Grace fought to keep her voice steady as she held his hand. "It's just temporary, baby. The doctors are helping your eyes get better." "I'm scared," Oliver whispered. "What if I can't see the stars anymore?" Grace's composure finally broke. She felt Ethan's hand on her shoulder as she bent over Oliver's bed, her tears falling silently. "You'll see them again," she promised. "All the stars, all the planets. We'll get your telescope out and watch them together." The next 24 hours became a nightmare of declining vital signs and increasing pressure readings. Oliver drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening more confused than the last. Grace refused to leave his side, even as her own exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Ethan brought her coffee, arranged for food she couldn't eat, and handled the constant stream of medical staff and administrative requirements. When Oliver's blood pressure suddenly dropped in the middle of the night, triggering alarms and bringing a rush of emergency personnel, Ethan held Grace back as the medical team worked, his own face pale with fear. The swelling isn't reducing as we'd hoped, Dr. Peterson informed them during morning rounds. The experimental treatment isn't working as quickly as we need it to. We may have to attempt the surgery again, despite the risks. What kind of risks? Grace asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Best case, partial vision loss. Worst case, the doctor's silence said everything she couldn't. Outside Oliver's room, Grace finally allowed herself to break down completely. "This is my fault," she sobbed into Ethan's shoulder. "If I'd found a way to get him treatment sooner, if I hadn't let Thomas take him." No, Ethan's voice was firm. "The only person at fault is Thomas. You've done everything humanly possible to protect Oliver, and you're not going to stop now." But as they watched Oliver's condition continue to deteriorate, both Grace and Ethan felt the weight of helplessness crushing them. All their resources, all their determination, all their love might not be enough to save one precious little boy who just wanted to see the stars again. Dr. Peterson gathered Grace and Ethan in her office early the next morning, the sunrise casting long shadows through the blinds. The doctor's face was grave as she laid out 2 sets of documents on her desk. "We've reached a critical decision point," she began, her voice heavy with the weight of her words. "The experimental treatment isn't working fast enough. We have 2 options, and both carry significant risks. You'll need to decide quickly, Grace." Grace gripped the arms of her chair, feeling Ethan's supportive presence beside her. "Tell me." Option 1, we proceed with the surgery immediately, despite the swelling. Our top neurosurgeon believes he can remove the tumor, but Dr. Peterson paused, choosing her words carefully. "The risk of permanent vision loss or other neurological damage is high, very high." The doctor pulled out a series of brain scans pointing to the areas of concern. Option 2 is more controversial. There's a new treatment protocol being tested at Crawford Memorial. Thomas's legal team has already filed an emergency petition. If you agree to transfer Oliver back to their care, they'll guarantee immediate access to the treatment. No, Grace's response was immediate. "We can't trust them, not after what they did." "The treatment itself is legitimate," Dr. Peterson admitted, "and their facilities are state-of-the-art." But she hesitated again. "They're requiring you to sign over full medical custody to Thomas as a condition of treatment. Permanently." Grace felt the room spin. "They're blackmailing me with my son's life." "They're offering to cover all costs," Dr. Peterson continued reluctantly. "Past and future medical care, rehabilitation, everything. But you would have no say in his treatment decisions. No legal rights to question or challenge their choices." Ethan leaned forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This is exactly what they did to the others. Using medical emergencies to force custody transfers." The others, Grace turned to him sharply. 3 other Crawford ex-wives lost their children this way. Each time there was a medical crisis, followed by a miracle recovery once the Crawfords gained control. Ethan's jaw clenched. "It's their signature move." Grace stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the hospital was coming to life, families arriving for visits, staff changing shifts. Normal life continuing while her world hung in the balance. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked without turning around. "An hour. Maybe less." Dr. Peterson's voice was sympathetic. "The pressure readings are climbing. We need to act before permanent damage occurs." Grace pressed her forehead against the cool glass, tears threatening to fall. "If we do the surgery now, what are his chances?" "Of survival?" "Good. Of retaining full vision and neurological function?" "Less than 30%. The doctor's honesty was brutal but necessary. "And the Crawford treatment? Their success rate data looks promising." But Grace, Dr. Peterson added gently, "Consider what success would mean in this case. Oliver alive and well, but potentially separated from you during his entire recovery. Maybe longer." Grace turned back to face them, her decision written in the set of her shoulders. "I need to see him before I decide." In Oliver's room, Grace sat beside her son's bed, holding his small hand. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused but seeking her face. "Mom, are you still there? I can't see you anymore." "I'm here, baby. I'll always be here." Grace's voice broke as she stroked his hair. "Oliver, I need you to know something. Everything I'm about to do, every choice I make, is because I love you more than anything in this world." "More than the stars," he mumbled, drifting back to sleep. "More than all the stars in the universe," Grace whispered. Back in Dr. Peterson's office, Grace stood tall as she made her decision. It wasn't just about Oliver's survival now, it was about his future, his happiness, his right to grow up with a mother who would fight for him no matter what. "Schedule the surgery," she said firmly. "Here, now, with you." As Dr. Peterson hurried to make the arrangements, Ethan touched Grace's arm gently. "Are you sure?" "The risks." I'm sure Grace's voice was steady despite her tears, because even if the worst happens, even if he loses his sight, he'll still have his mother's love. And that's something the Crawfords can never buy or steal. As Oliver was being prepped for surgery, Ethan's phone exploded with urgent messages. Margaret's voice was tense when he finally answered. "Sir, the Crawfords have launched their attack. They're executing a hostile takeover attempt." Ethan moved to a quiet corner of the waiting room, keeping one eye on Grace as she signed the final surgical consent forms. How bad? "They've leveraged their position in 3 of our major subsidiaries. The board is meeting in emergency session. They're demanding your immediate presence." Margaret paused. "Mr. Crawford Sr. is leading the charge personally. He's threatening to remove you as CEO if you don't appear within the hour." The timing wasn't coincidental. The Crawfords had waited until Oliver's most critical moment, forcing Ethan to choose between saving his company and supporting Grace. So Margaret continued urgently, "They've already convinced several key shareholders to support them. Our stock is falling. The media is running with the story. If we don't respond immediately..." Grace approached, her face pale but determined. "They're taking him to surgery now. Dr. Peterson says it could take 6 hours." She noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" Ethan muted his phone. "The Crawfords are trying to take over my company. The board is meeting in 30 minutes. If I'm not there, I'll lose everything I've built." "Go," Grace said immediately. "You've already done so much. I can handle this part alone." But the thought of leaving her to face those endless surgical hours by herself felt wrong on a fundamental level. His company might be worth billions, but watching Grace's strength in the face of impossible choices had taught him what really mattered. "Margaret," he unmuted the phone, "implement emergency protocol Delta. Lock down all trading of company shares. And tell the board." He looked at Grace. "Making his decision, tell them their CEO is dealing with a more important crisis." "Sir, with respect, this could cost you everything." "No," Ethan's voice was firm. "Abandoning Grace and Oliver right now, that would cost me everything that matters." The next hour brought a barrage of calls and messages. The board voted to suspend him pending an emergency review. The company's stock plummeted. Business news channels ran breaking stories about the imminent fall of Caldwell Enterprises. But Ethan sat quietly beside Grace in the surgical waiting room, his hand steady when she needed something to hold on to. He ordered coffee they didn't drink and food they couldn't eat. When updates from the operating room brought worrying news about Oliver's vital signs, he held her as she cried. His phone buzzed again, Crawford Sr. himself this time. The message was simple: last chance. Come to the board meeting now, support the merger, and we'll ensure Oliver receives the best care money can buy. Stay with her, and you lose it all. Ethan's reply was equally brief: some things aren't for sale. As the surgery entered its 4th hour, Margaret arrived in person, carrying an armful of documents requiring immediate attention. "The Crawfords are systematically dismantling everything you've built," she reported quietly. "They're using your absence to paint you as unstable, unfit for leadership." "How many jobs are at risk?" Ethan asked, his responsibility to his employees weighing heavily. "Thousands, potentially. The Crawfords' restructuring plan is aggressive." Grace, who had been dozing fitfully, stirred at their conversation. "Ethan, please. Don't sacrifice your company for us. Your employees need you." Ethan took her hand, his decision unwavering. "Right now, you and Oliver need me more. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. My father taught me that before he died, he turned to Margaret. Implement the contingency plan we discussed." "All of it." Margaret's eyes widened. "The nuclear option? Sir, that would mean liquidating my personal assets, converting my shares to employee ownership, triggering the anti-hostile takeover protocols." Ethan's smile was grim. "The Crawfords want my company? Let them try taking it from 10,000 employee owners instead of one CEO." As Margaret hurried away to execute his orders, Grace stared at him in disbelief. "You're giving up your company to help us." "No," Ethan squeezed her hand. "I'm saving it by remembering what it was meant to be, a force for good, not just profit. The Crawfords forgot that money isn't the only form of wealth." He looked toward the operating room doors. "Oliver reminded me of that the day we met." While Oliver fought for his life in surgery, Margaret burst into the waiting room, her typically composed demeanor shaken. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting a folder into Ethan's hands. "Our legal team found it while reviewing the Crawford family's private medical records." Inside were documents spanning decades, medical reports, court orders, and confidential settlements involving not just Thomas, but 3 generations of Crawford men. Each file told the same disturbing story: children developing mysterious illnesses, mothers losing custody battles, miraculous recoveries once the Crawfords gained control. "They've been doing this for years," Grace whispered, reading over Ethan's shoulder, "manipulating medical conditions to gain custody. But how?" Margaret pulled out another document. "Dr. James Crawford, Thomas's grandfather, developed an experimental drug in the 1970s. It was never approved for public use, but the family kept manufacturing it privately. When administered carefully, it can create symptoms mimicking various neurological conditions." The evidence was damning. Financial records showed payments to doctors, judges, and hospital administrators. Private correspondence revealed the family's methodology, identifying vulnerable mothers, isolating them socially and financially, then using their children's orchestrated medical crises to gain legal control. Thomas's first wife, Margaret continued, died under suspicious circumstances after threatening to expose them. The official report called it a suicide, but she handed over a private investigator's findings that suggested a very different conclusion. Grace's hands trembled as she read through the files. The headaches, Oliver's symptoms, they started right after Thomas showed up at his school. He must have found a way to expose Oliver to the drug. Ethan finished grimly, creating a medical emergency he could exploit. Linda Martinez arrived as they were reviewing the evidence, her expression fierce with determination. "This changes everything. With proof of deliberate medical manipulation, we can not only stop Thomas's custody claim, but bring criminal charges against the entire family." But Grace was focused on something else: a list of children's names, dates, and medical conditions. "These other mothers, we need to help them too. They deserve to know the truth about what was done to their children." As if on cue, Dr. Peterson emerged from the operating room, still in her surgical scrubs. Her face showed both exhaustion and confusion. The surgery revealed something unexpected: the tissue around Oliver's tumor. "It's not responding like typical growth. I've never seen anything like it." When shown the Crawford family's medical records, the doctor's expression darkened with professional outrage. "This explains the unusual test results. They've been poisoning him systematically, creating symptoms they could control." Ethan was already on the phone with federal authorities. The evidence of decades of medical fraud, child endangerment, and possible murder would bring the full weight of the justice system down on the Crawford family. Linda touched her arm gently. Once this goes public, it will trigger the largest medical custody investigation in state history. You won't just be saving Oliver, you'll be helping dozens of other families get justice." But Grace was barely listening, her focus drawn to the surgical update board where Oliver's status had just changed from in surgery to recovery in the end. That was all that mattered. Her son was alive, and the truth that would protect him had finally come to light. "He's going to need time to heal," Dr. Peterson said softly. "Not just from the surgery, but from whatever they've been giving him. But children are remarkably resilient. With proper care and support, he'll have everything he needs," Ethan promised, his hand finding Grace's. "And so will every other child and mother the Crawfords have hurt. This ends now." In the midst of the chaos surrounding the Crawford family's exposure, Margaret again approached Ethan and Grace in the hospital waiting room, this time carrying a different set of files. "There's something else you both need to see." She laid out a series of printed emails and financial analyses dating back several years. "These anonymous warnings," Margaret began, "the ones that saved Caldwell Enterprises from multiple hostile takeovers. We've confirmed they all came from the same source." She turned to Grace. "From you." Grace paled slightly, but didn't deny it. Ethan leafed through the documents, recognition dawning in his eyes. The careful analyses, the ethical considerations, the precise writing style. It had been Grace all along, working as a night cleaner at Marshall Financial, quietly protecting his company from the shadows. "You prevented the Henderson merger," he said softly. "Exposed the Crawford family's attempt to infiltrate our board. Warned us about the pension fund manipulation. All while struggling to make ends meet yourself. Why?" Grace looked down at her hands, embarrassed. "I saw the patterns because I'd lived them. The Crawfords' tactics, their way of slowly taking control. I couldn't let them do to your company what they did to my life. Besides," she added quietly, "you were always kind to me in high school. That mattered." Margaret produced more documents. She's been doing this for years. Anonymous tips to regulatory agencies about predatory business practices. Detailed analyses sent to small businesses warning them about fraudulent investment schemes, all written during her night shifts using the computers she was supposed to be dusting. The scope of Grace's quiet influence became clear as they reviewed the files. While struggling to support Oliver, working multiple jobs, she had used her brilliant mind and business acumen to protect others from financial predators. Her anonymous warnings had saved dozens of companies and hundreds of jobs. "The night security guard caught me once," Grace admitted. "But instead of reporting me, he started bringing me coffee. Said anyone working that hard to help others deserved a little kindness in return." Ethan's board members had been frantically trying to reach him all day, demanding explanations for his absence during the company crisis. Now, looking at the evidence of Grace's years of anonymous protection, he finally had his answer. "You didn't just save my company," he realized. "You've been its conscience. While I was focused on profit margins and market share, you were protecting what really mattered, the people whose lives depended on our decisions." Margaret cleared her throat. "There's more. The employee ownership transition you initiated. Grace's anonymous analysis from last year actually outlined the entire framework. You implemented her suggestions without even knowing they came from her." Grace blushed deeply. "I just saw how much your employees cared about the company, how hard they worked. They deserved to have a stake in its success." Ethan stared at her in wonder. While he had been building his empire from his penthouse office, Grace had been protecting it from the ground up, asking nothing in return. Her brilliant mind had never stopped working, even when life had denied her every opportunity to use it professionally. "The board needs to know about this," he said firmly. "Not just about your role in protecting the company, but about your ability to see what really matters in business. We need someone like you in leadership." Grace started to protest, but Ethan held up his hand, not as a favor, not out of gratitude, but because you've proven yourself to be exactly what Caldwell Enterprises needs, someone who understands that true success isn't measured in dollars, but in lives improved and people protected. The hospital corridor outside Oliver's recovery room transformed into an unexpected gathering place as news of the Crawford family's crimes spread throughout the community. Mabel from the diner arrived first, bringing homemade soup and organizing a schedule of volunteers to ensure Grace never had to sit alone during Oliver's recovery. Mrs. Callahan set up camp in a comfortable chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a new blanket for Oliver. "He'll need something warm and cozy during his rehabilitation," she insisted, her eyes tearing up whenever the boy stirred in his sleep. The regular customers from Rosie's diner began appearing in shifts, bringing food, cards, and small gifts. The mechanic who had kept Grace's old car running offered to completely overhaul it for free. "Can't have my favorite customer worrying about transportation during her boy's recovery," he gruffly explained. Linda Martinez arrived with a team of lawyers, all volunteering their services to help other families affected by the Crawford schemes. The waiting room became an impromptu legal clinic, with mothers sharing stories and finding strength in their shared experiences. Oliver's teachers from Franklin Elementary organized a reading program, taking turns sitting by his bed and reading his favorite stories as he drifted in and out of consciousness. His classmates sent a handmade book of drawings and get well messages, each page bright with childhood optimism. Even the night security guard from Marshall Financial stopped by, bringing coffee just like old times. "Always knew you were something special," he told Grace with a warm smile. "Someone who helps others like you did. Karma's bound to come around." But the hospital staff, moved by the outpouring of support, bent rules about visiting hours and visitor numbers. Dr. Peterson found herself sharing coffee with Grace's makeshift family, discussing Oliver's progress with people who had become invested in his recovery. Local news stations picked up the story, not just of the Crawford family's crimes, but of a community coming together to support one of their own. Small business owners who had benefited from Grace's anonymous warnings over the years began recognizing her handwriting, her style in the analyses that had saved their livelihoods. "You helped us without even knowing us," one emotional restaurant owner told Grace. "Now it's our turn to help you." A local charity organization started a recovery fund for all the families affected by the Crawfords' medical manipulation. Donations poured in from across the city, from people touched by the story of a mother's fight for justice and a community's response to evil with overwhelming good. Through it all, Ethan remained a steady presence, watching in amazement as Grace's quiet impact on the community revealed itself. The woman who had worked in shadows, helping others while asking nothing for herself, had unknowingly built a network of support stronger than all the Crawfords' wealth and influence. "I never knew," Grace whispered to him one evening, overwhelmed by another delivery of home-cooked meals and hand-drawn cards. "I thought we were alone all this time." "You helped build this," Ethan replied softly. "Every person you assisted, every family you protected, every act of kindness you showed, it all came back when you needed it most. That's the real power of community, something the Crawfords never understood." As Oliver began showing signs of recovery, his room filled with the sound of quiet conversations, gentle laughter, and the steady presence of people who had become more than neighbors or customers. They had become family. In fighting against the Crawfords' corruption, Grace had not only exposed their crimes but had revealed something far more powerful: the enduring strength of human connection and compassion. Spring sunlight streamed through Oliver's hospital room window as he took his first unassisted steps since the surgery. 3 months of recovery had transformed the space into something between a hospital room and a child's bedroom, with star charts on the walls and a small telescope by the window that Ethan had brought for stargazing on clear nights. "Look, Mom," Oliver called out excitedly, his voice stronger each day. No more Walker. Grace watched from the doorway, tears of joy threatening to spill as her son made his wobbly way toward her. "Doctor." Peterson stood nearby, beaming with professional pride. His vision is almost completely restored, the doctor reported, reviewing the latest test results. Now that the Crawford's drug is completely out of his system, his recovery has exceeded all our expectations. He's a fighter just like his mother. The legal proceedings against the Crawford family had moved swiftly, the evidence too overwhelming to deny. Thomas had taken a plea deal, turning state's evidence against his family in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed decades of systematic abuse, manipulation, and criminal conspiracy that had destroyed countless lives. Crawford Sr. and several key family members were facing lengthy prison terms. Their medical facilities were being investigated, their assets frozen, and their carefully constructed empire crumbling under the weight of justice. The family name, once synonymous with power and prestige, now represented one of the largest medical fraud cases in state history. Mum, Oliver called out as he reached her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Can we go to the roof garden? I want to practice walking there." The hospital's rooftop garden had become their special place, where Oliver could feel the sun on his face and Grace could watch him grow stronger day by day. As they made their way to the elevator, supported by Ethan, who had become a constant presence in their lives, they passed the wall of photographs in the pediatric ward. New pictures had been added, children rescued from the Crawfords' manipulation, reunited with mothers who had fought for years to reclaim them. Each image told a story of healing and justice. "The support fund has reached its goal," Ethan reported quietly as they watched Oliver explore the garden's paths. "Every affected family will receive compensation for medical expenses and ongoing care. The Crawford properties are being converted into legitimate medical facilities, overseen by an independent board." Grace nodded, her heart full as she watched Oliver pause to examine a butterfly landing on a nearby flower. His natural curiosity, temporarily dimmed by illness and medication, had returned in full force. "He asks about the stars every night now," she said softly. "No more headaches, no more fear, just my beautiful, curious boy." The garden had become a gathering place for other recovering families. Children who had been used as pawns in the Crawford schemes now played together while their mothers shared stories of survival and healing. The bonds formed in tragedy had transformed into lasting friendships. "The final settlement hearing is next week," Ethan reminded her gently. "Are you ready?" Grace watched as Oliver carefully counted the petals on a daisy, his voice clear as he recited numbers that once would have been blurred by drug-induced confusion. "More than ready," she replied. "It's time to close this chapter and start writing a new one." A breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers across the garden. Oliver looked up, his smile bright and real, no longer shadowed by pain or fear. "Mom, Ethan, look what I can do." He demonstrated a small jump, wobbling but staying upright, his triumph evident in every movement. In that moment, watching her son reclaim his childhood one small victory at a time, Grace knew that true justice wasn't just about punishment for the guilty. It was about healing for the innocent, about rebuilding what was broken, about transforming pain into purpose. One quiet evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep in his hospital room, Grace and Ethan found themselves in what had become their usual spot in the rooftop garden. The city lights twinkled below, competing with the stars above, while a gentle spring breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. "I found something today," Ethan said softly, pulling an old photograph from his wallet. It was worn around the edges, clearly handled often over the years. Grace recognized it immediately, their high school debate team photo, where she stood slightly apart from the group, but Ethan's gaze was turned toward her instead of the camera. "You kept it all this time?" Grace asked, touching the photograph gently. "Why?" "For the same reason you kept mine under your pillow," he admitted. "Some people leave marks on your heart that time can't erase." He hesitated, then added, "I wanted to ask you to prom, you know." Had the whole speech planned out. Grace's eyes widened. "But you were dating Rebecca Mitchell." "No," Ethan laughed softly. "Everyone assumed that, But I was actually staying late at school helping you with the yearbook committee. Those were the best parts of my day." The memory brought a flush to Grace's cheeks. "I used to look forward to those afternoons. You were the only person who saw me as more than just the scholarship girl." Their hands found each other's in the darkness, fingers intertwining naturally. The past few months had brought them closer than either had imagined possible, their shared battle against the Crawfords forging a bond that went beyond their teenage memories. "Oliver asked me something interesting today," Grace said, her voice thoughtful. "He wanted to know if you were going to be his new dad." Ethan's breath caught. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that you were someone very special who cared about both of us very much." She turned to face him. "I told him that sometimes life gives you a second chance at happiness, but it's okay to take things slowly." Slowly, Ethan agreed, squeezing her hand. "Though I think I've been falling in love with you since I was 17." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unhurried. Grace's free hand touched the spot where she used to keep his photograph. "I never stopped thinking about you, you know. Even during the darkest times with Thomas, I'd remember how you made me feel like I could accomplish anything." "You did accomplish everything," Ethan corrected her. "You raised an amazing son, protected countless people through your anonymous work, and brought down one of the city's most corrupt families, all while showing more grace and dignity than most people could imagine." Their first kiss, when it came, felt like coming home. It was gentle and sweet, carrying the weight of years of unspoken feelings and newfound understanding. When they parted, both were smiling, their foreheads touching. "Oliver's going to be insufferable about this," Grace laughed softly. "He's been trying to play matchmaker for weeks." "Smart kid," Ethan murmured. "Takes after his mother." Below them, the city continued its nightly rhythm, but up in their rooftop sanctuary, time seemed to slow. They had both traveled long, difficult roads to reach this moment, paths marked by loss, struggle, and ultimately triumph. Now, under the same stars they'd gazed at as teenagers, they found themselves at the beginning of a new journey, one they would walk together. 1 year later, snow fell softly outside the window of Grace and Oliver's new home, a cozy house not far from Mrs. Callahan's apartment building. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, its branches laden with a mix of handmade ornaments from Oliver's hospital days and new decorations they'd chosen as a family. Oliver sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully wrapping a present for Ethan. "Do you think he'll like it?" Mommy asked, holding up the framed drawing he'd made, a picture of the three of them stargazing on the hospital roof, the night Ethan had first brought the telescope. "He'll love it," Grace assured him, helping him with the ribbon. The past year had brought changes they'd never imagined. Grace had accepted a position as Chief Ethics Officer at Caldwell Enterprises, where her insight and integrity were reshaping corporate culture. The employee ownership program she'd anonymously suggested was transforming lives, creating a new model of business that other companies were rushing to emulate. The doorbell rang, and Oliver ran to answer it, knowing it would be Ethan. Their regular Friday night dinners had become a cherished tradition, though tonight was special, their first Christmas Eve together as a family. Ethan entered bearing gifts and wearing the slightly lopsided scarf Oliver had insisted on knitting for him. Just in time, Grace called from the kitchen. The hot chocolates ready, she'd recreated their hospital rooftop conversations with a special recipe that had become their comfort drink during Oliver's recovery. They gathered in the living room, the Christmas lights casting a warm glow as Oliver distributed presents. "Wait," he exclaimed suddenly. "We forgot the most important part." He rushed to get the old photograph, the one that had started everything, and placed it on the mantel. "You don't need to keep it under your pillow anymore, Mom," he said wisely. "The real thing is better." Ethan pulled Grace close, both of them watching as Oliver arranged his toy telescope by the window, ever hopeful for a break in the clouds to see the stars. The boy who had once been too sick to lift his head now bounded with energy, his recovery complete, his future bright. "I have something for both of you," Ethan said softly, pulling out a small envelope. Inside was a deed to a plot of land outside the city, where light pollution wouldn't hide the stars. For our future observatory, he explained. A place where we can all watch the stars together. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she read the name on the deed, the Oliver Whitman Memorial Observatory for Young Astronomers, a place where children from all backgrounds could learn about the stars, funded by the settlement money from the Crawford case. This is better than any Christmas miracle, Oliver declared, hugging them both. We're a real family now. As the snow continued to fall, they sat together drinking hot chocolate, sharing stories, and making plans for the future. The old photograph on the mantel caught the Christmas lights, a reminder of where their story had begun with a little boy's chance encounter, a mother's unwavering love, and a man who chose integrity over empire. Outside, carolers from the neighborhood began singing, their voices carrying through the snowy evening. Grace looked at her son, healthy and happy, and at Ethan, who had proved that true love could survive decades of separation. She thought about the long journey that had brought them here, through pain and fear, through courage and hope, to this moment of perfect happiness. This was their real Christmas miracle, not just surviving, but finding their way back to each other, creating something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. As Oliver's voice joined the carolers and Ethan's hand found hers, Grace knew that some dreams take time to come true, but when they do, they're more wonderful than anything you could have imagined. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own experiences with love, family, and second chances. Your support means everything to our team. Please subscribe to our channel to join our growing community of storytellers and story lovers. Every subscription helps us create more meaningful content like this. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and share it with friends and family who might need a reminder that miracles can happen, and that love and integrity always triumph in the end. Thank you for being part of our journey. Together we can spread more stories of hope, courage, and the power of never giving up. See you in our next video. Best regards. The Story Team.